Hi, and welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. This is Lesson 15, the first of two on FOB, Free on Board, Named Port of Shipment. But first, of course, the necessary disclaimer. I am not a lawyer, and the contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents of this lesson are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication, number 723E, of the International Chamber of Commerce. My explanations, my comments and my opinions are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future for you in trade. FOB is probably the most commonly used, most commonly misunderstood, and therefore the most commonly misused trade term. It is very commonly misused for container shipments, even for air shipments. First, we'll go through what the book states and explain how it works. Then we'll look at why it is not appropriate for container shipments. Of course, if the seller and buyer don't mention Incoterms 2020 in their contract, they are free to use whatever they like, however they like, and suffer the possible consequences. In this lesson, we'll look specifically at FOB, the more complex and contentious articles A2 and B2, delivery and taking delivery, and why this rule is not suitable for container shipments. In the next lesson then, we'll look at A10, B10 notices, A6, B6 delivery and transport document, A9, B9 allocation of costs, and letters of credit. So let's get stuck into it. A2, delivery. We'll look at each of the paragraphs individually so that they make much more sense than the lawyer-speak fruit salad of words in the book. The first paragraph. The seller must deliver the goods either by placing them on board the vessel nominated by the buyer, at the loading point, if any, indicated by the buyer, at the named port of shipment, or by procuring the goods so delivered. Let's look at this first paragraph again and make it more easily readable. The seller must deliver the goods either by placing them on board the vessel nominated by the buyer, at the loading point, if any, indicated by the buyer, at the named port of shipment, or by procuring the goods so delivered. The second paragraph, the seller must deliver the goods, 1, on the agreed date, or 2, at the time within the agreed period notified by the buyer under B10, or 3, if no such time is notified, then at the end of the agreed period, and 4, in the manner customary at the port. What does option 3 mean? If no such time is notified, then at the end of the agreed period. This is a legal construct for contract purposes to say that if the seller cannot actually deliver because the buyer didn't give the required information, then at the end of the agreed period, the seller is deemed to have delivered. Third paragraph. If no specific loading point has been indicated by the buyer, the seller may select the point within the named port of shipment that best suits its purposes. How can the last paragraph work? If no specific loading point has been indicated by the buyer, the seller may select the point within the named port of shipment that best suits its purpose. It can have two interpretations. One, the seller has informed the buyer in advance the point within the port of loading where they are to bring their ship to load. Or two, this is again simply a legal construct to mean that if the buyer fails to indicate a specific point or its vessel fails to turn up, then at the end of the contract period, the seller has delivered anyway. It goes hand in hand with option 3, even though logically and logistically it's not workable. Of course the seller cannot just put its goods on any wharf it feels like and leave them there. To start with, they would not be loaded on board. What does "or by procuring the goods so delivered" mean? It refers to a string sale in which a buyer, buying from the seller the goods which are loaded on board its vessel, then sells those goods so procured under a separate contract to the next buyer, and so on. So the first buyer becomes the second seller, and so on, possibly multiple times. There can even be multiple second buyers, 23 in one case I had. This is reasonably common in shipments of certain commodities. B2, the buyer must take delivery of the goods when they have been delivered under A2. By now, you might be thinking this all sounds terribly similar to Lesson 14, FAS. Indeed it is, because the only difference between FOB and FAS is substituting alongside with loaded on board. These two rules are very nearly identical in wording. This rule can only be used for bulk or breakbulk by sea or inland waterway transport. Indeed, it is the second of 4 rules under the heading Rules for Sea and Inland Waterway Transport. We'll delve a little further into FOB now. The use of FOB goes back at least several centuries. It originally was abbreviated in common practice as F.O.B. lowercase and can be seen printed that way in many legal cases. It was published as uppercase F.O.B. in the first set of Incoterms rules in 1936. These 3 letters stand for free on board, and despite occasional and mistaken statements, do not stand for and never have stood for freight on board. FOB was first used in the sailing ship era, when the seller would use its men to load its bags, barrels, etc. onto the buyer's ship. Once the goods passed the ship's rail, delivery was achieved because the goods were now on the buyer's ship. By including its loading cost in its selling price, the seller is selling delivered free on board the buyer's ship. The Industrial Revolution gradually brought about larger and heavier cargo and mechanised means of loading ships by crane. Ship owners became carriers, providing shipping space in their vessels for the goods of other parties, sellers and buyers. A famous legal judgment in 1954 ruled, quote, "Only the most enthusiastic lawyer could watch with satisfaction the spectacle of liability shifting uneasily as the cargo sways at the end of a derrick across a notional perpendicular projecting from the ship's rail." This ruling referred to the fact that the goods would be lowered into the hold of the ship, so the imaginary line above the rail was of no relevance. Now, on board generally means that the goods are safely at rest in the hold, disconnected from the sling or rope, or beyond the spout or conveyor belt that brought them there. Yet it took until Incoterms 2010 for the ship's rail concept to be dropped from the Incoterms FOB definition. With bulk and breakbulk cargo, the seller delivers by placing its goods on or in the buyer's vessel. Delivery is not complete until all the contract goods have been loaded. If the vessel is damaged during loading so that it cannot accept all the goods, then the seller has not delivered. The seller might consider requiring the buyer to provide evidence of insurance so that the seller can claim under it should that portion of its goods already loaded on the buyer's vessel be damaged or destroyed before completing loading of all the goods. FOB refers purely to a port-to-port shipment, where goods are loaded onto the vessel at a particular port and discharged from the vessel at another particular port. The contract of carriage is purely port-to-port. FOB is not appropriate where goods are handed over to a carrier before they're on board the vessel, such as with containers. FOB is not appropriate for air, rail or road transport where no seaport is relevant. Containerisation moved the seller's delivery point back from the ship's rail to an earlier place and point in time, as we've seen with FCA. Containerisation also led to the massive growth of the freight forwarding industry, acting as carriers in their own right or as freight brokers. Now, in a freight collect transaction, the buyer's freight forwarder typically uses their agent in the seller's country to coordinate the shipping booking and movement of the container. For an FCL, a full container load, the seller, usually at its premises, places its goods into the container provided by the agent of the buyer's forwarder. The alternative is that the seller, using its own transport, delivers the goods to the terminal nominated by the agent of the buyer's forwarder, where they will later be loaded into a container. These alternatives will vary depending on the goods and the usual procedures or custom of the seller's country. There is no contract between the seller and that forwarder, terminal or carrier. For an LCL, less than container load, the seller usually loads its goods at its premises onto the truck provided by the agent of the buyer's forwarder. The goods will be taken to a CFS, a container freight station, a terminal, the identity and location of which is usually unknown to the seller. The goods will then be loaded or consolidated along with other goods from other sellers into a groupage container. Again, there is no contract between the seller and that forwarder, CFS or carrier. If FOB is used for container shipment, both FCL and LCL, there will be potential problems. For instance, the seller does not control, does not pay for, and does not have a contract with the buyer's carrier for movement of the container from the seller's premises into the terminal, then to the wharf and onto the vessel. The seller will not even know where their goods are located at any given moment. By using FOB for shipment of goods in a container, the seller is implying that it does not deliver until the container is on board the vessel. Till then, the risk of loss of or damage to the goods remains that of the seller, even while their goods are completely beyond the seller's direct or indirect control. If the loading on board is delayed, even to a later ship, then the seller seems to also accept responsibility and risk for this non-delivery or late delivery and possible breach of contract, again, even though entirely out of their control. To reiterate, FOB is not appropriate where goods are handed over to a carrier before they are on board the vessel, such as with containers and, of course, air, rail or road. In our next lesson, we will continue looking at FOB, A10 and B10 notices, A6 and B6 delivery transport document, and A9, B9 allocation of costs. And then we're going to look at bills of lading and letters of credit. We'll again go much deeper than simply what the Incoterms 2020 rule tells us. As always, I will explain what the book says first, but then I'll examine the issues arising for these articles as we go along. If you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to each new lesson, please hit the subscribe button and the bell. And please feel free to leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below. Till next lesson.